They didn't forget me. Forgetting is accidental, clumsy, almost forgivable. This was deliberate, surgical. Everyone else had an envelope, thick with ivory paper and gold lettering, arriving weeks in advance like a quiet announcement of belonging. I learned about the wedding the way you learn about storms that are already overhead, through whispers, screenshots, and a group photo posted too early by someone who didn't realize I wasn't supposed to see it. My cousin in white, smiling so wide it looked rehearsed. My aunt standing proud, chin lifted, the architect of this perfect family moment. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. When I finally asked, gently, carefully, like someone stepping around broken glass, my aunt didn't apologize. She didn't hesitate. She didn't pretend it was a mistake. She said my name the way people say, traffic, or weather, as if I were an inconvenience of nature. Don't make it about you. That sentence landed with weight. It told me everything. That my absence was a choice. That my presence was optional. That my feelings were noise best muted to protect the harmony they had curated without me. This wasn't the first time. It never is. Exclusion doesn't show up once and vanish. It repeats itself until you start to doubt your own worth. There had been birthdays I learned about afterward, holidays where plans were already set, family group chats that went quiet the moment I spoke. I had learned the choreography early: be smaller, be quieter, don't disrupt the image. Favoritism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers so consistently that you mistake it for truth. What made this cut deeper was the performance of innocence around it. The smiles. The insistence that nothing was wrong. The implication that my hurt was an overreaction, that my silence would be interpreted as maturity, and my pain as vanity. Quiet cruelty wears a polite face. It doesn't throw stones, it closes doors and calls it coincidence. It leaves you outside long enough that people forget you were ever meant to be inside. I nodded when she spoke. That nod was a survival reflex, honed over years of swallowing disappointment without choking on it. I nodded because arguing would only confirm their narrative, that I was difficult, dramatic, too much. I nodded because I had learned that dignity in rooms like that looks like compliance. But inside, something shifted. Not anger, clarity. Exclusion does something strange. It strips away illusion. Once you see how easily you're removed from someone else's joy, you stop begging for a seat at tables built to keep you hungry. You start asking better questions. Why do I keep auditioning for love that comes with conditions? Why do I accept proximity as affection? Why do I allow people who benefit from my silence to call it grace? They thought they were minimizing me. What they were actually doing was unburdening me. In the days that followed, I watched the wedding planning unfold online like a distant broadcast. Dress fittings, cake tastings, hashtags rehearsed for virality. It was all very curated, very correct. And I realized something unsettling. They wanted the image more than the people. They wanted unity without complexity, celebration without history. I was inconvenient not because I was wrong, but because I remembered too much. Public exclusion is a statement. It says, we will decide when you matter. It counts on your shame to finish the job. It expects you to disappear quietly so the story stays clean. That's where they miscalculated. Because exclusion doesn't erase you, it refines you. It forces you to confront the question most people avoid: if I'm not invited into their version of happiness, what does my own look like? I didn't confront them. I didn't send long messages or demand explanations. I didn't weaponize tears. I did something far more dangerous to people who thrive on control. I stopped asking for permission. I stopped centering their milestones as proof of my belonging. I stopped waiting for validation from people who confused proximity with power. The cruelty wasn't loud, but it was effective. It taught me that love without inclusion is performance. That family without accountability is just shared DNA and shared excuses. And that sometimes the most radical response to being erased is to create something so unmistakably yours that it can't be ignored, even when they try. They told me not to make it about me. They were right about one thing: I didn't need their event to matter. I needed my life to. And in that realization, The story stopped being about what they withheld and started becoming about what I was finally ready to claim. Public exclusion was their move. It was meant to shrink me, to keep the spotlight narrow and controlled. But it did the opposite. It gave me space. It gave me silence. It gave me the audacity to imagine joy that didn't require an invitation. They thought the absence would be the end of it. They had no idea it was the beginning. I didn't cry in front of them. That was the first thing they noticed, and the first thing they misunderstood. They expected anger, accusations, a scene that would justify their decision. They expected me to beg for inclusion or explode in self-defense. When neither happened, they assumed I was fine. People like that always do. They mistake restraint for weakness, silence for acceptance, dignity for defeat. They never consider that quiet can be a form of control. When my aunt said, "Don't make it about you," I nodded, not because she was right, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of my pain. There is a special kind of grace that isn't gentle. It's strategic. It's the grace you wear when you realize that arguing with people who benefit from misunderstanding you is a waste of breath. So I chose stillness. I chose to swallow the words that wanted to scream. I chose to leave the room with my head high, even though my chest felt hollow. Silenced grace is not passive. It's pressure contained. It's the discipline of knowing that not every injustice deserves an immediate reaction, especially when the people watching are waiting for you to unravel. They wanted proof that excluding me was justified, that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I denied them that narrative. I let them keep their assumptions while I kept my composure. Behind that composure, though, was a reckoning. Grace doesn't erase pain, it delays its expression. At night alone, I replayed conversations in my head, wondering when I became optional. I questioned memories, searched for moments where I might have earned their dismissal. That's the cruel trick of quiet exclusion. It makes you interrogate yourself instead of the people who wronged you. But grace, real grace, doesn't stay silent forever. It listens. It learns, it waits. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped trying to clarify misunderstandings that were never misunderstandings to begin with. I stopped chasing closure from people who were invested in keeping me uncertain. Instead, I observed, I noticed patterns. Who spoke over me? Who remembered me only when convenient? Who smiled in public and dismissed me in private? Grace sharpened my vision, and something powerful happened in that silence. I reclaimed my energy. I redirected it inward. I poured it into things that didn't require approval, into my work, my body, my peace. I began to understand that grace isn't about being kind to people who hurt you. It's about being loyal to yourself when they won't be. My silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. They thought I'd fade quietly into the background, carrying the weight of rejection like a secret shame. What they didn't see was the shift happening beneath the surface. Grace gave me distance, and distance gave me perspective, and perspective gave me freedom. The moment I stopped asking why I wasn't invited was the moment everything changed. Why keeps you trapped in other people's logic? Why hands them control over your self-worth? I replaced it with how. How do I want my life to feel? How do I celebrate myself without waiting for permission? How do I build a story that doesn't require their validation to be real? Reclaiming the narrative didn't start with revenge. It started with ownership. I realized that for years, my milestones had been quiet because I'd been trained to stay small, to not overshadow, to not disrupt, to not make it about me. So I decided to do the unthinkable. I decided to make it about me. Not loudly, intentionally. I planned my own seaside ceremony, not a wedding, not a competition, but a declaration. A declaration that my life didn't pause just because they excluded me. That joy wasn't something rationed out by family hierarchy. The ocean didn't care who approved of me. The wind didn't need an invitation list. The horizon didn't ask who thought I deserved happiness. I chose every detail myself. The location, the colors, the words spoken aloud. There was no compromise, no shrinking, no explaining. For the first time, I wasn't performing belonging. I was embodying it. Friends came who had chosen me consistently. Strangers watched and smiled. Cameras captured something raw and unfiltered, a woman standing fully in her own life. When the video went viral, it wasn't because it was flashy. It was because it was honest. People recognized the story instantly: the girl left out, the woman who stopped asking for a seat and built her own table. The comments poured in, not with pity but with recognition. This is healing. This is power. This is what self-respect looks like. That's when my family noticed. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible. Suddenly, my absence had created a presence they couldn't control. Messages came in, confused, defensive, curious. Some congratulated me. Some asked why they hadn't known. I didn't rush to explain. The narrative was no longer theirs to manage. I had already told it, clearly, publicly, on my terms. Reclaiming the narrative isn't about embarrassing the people who excluded you. It's about outgrowing the version of yourself that needed their approval. I didn't replace their wedding with mine. I replaced their judgment with my freedom. And that was the real revenge. They invited everyone to their celebration except me. So I created a life so full, so visible, so undeniably mine that exclusion lost its power. Not because they apologized. Not because they understood. But because I no longer needed them to. That's what happens when you stop waiting to be chosen. You choose yourself, and the world pays attention. The decision to go to the sea wasn't aesthetic. It was instinctive. Water has always been honest in a way people aren't. It doesn't pretend to welcome you and then close ranks when you arrive. It doesn't rank you, exclude you, or measure your worth by proximity to someone else's spotlight. The sea doesn't care who invited whom. It simply exists, vast, unapologetic, powerful. That's why I chose it. Not to compete with anyone's wedding, not to prove anything to anyone, but to stand somewhere that reflected the life I was finally choosing to claim. I didn't call it a wedding. I didn't call it a party. I called it a ceremony because ceremonies are about meaning, not permission. Every detail was deliberate. The dress wasn't white, it was soft, flowing, the color of sand just before sunset. It moved when I moved, free of stiffness, free of expectation. I wanted nothing restrictive on my body the day I reclaimed myself. The music wasn't traditional either, no inherited rules, no borrowed scripts. Just sounds that felt like breath, like release, like something opening instead of closing. As I stood barefoot, toes sinking into cool sand, I felt something loosen inside me that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. The weight of being tolerated instead of embraced. The tension of constantly editing myself to fit into rooms where my presence was always conditional. The sea didn't ask me to be quieter. The wind didn't flinch when I laughed. The horizon didn't shrink to make someone else look bigger. For the first time, my joy didn't feel like a rebellion, it felt like alignment. People gathered, not out of obligation, not because of bloodlines or family politics, but because they wanted to be there. Friends who had shown up consistently. People who had never once made me feel like an afterthought. Even a few strangers who happened to be nearby paused, drawn in by something they couldn't name. That mattered to me more than a packed guest list ever could. Presence. Real presence is louder than numbers. I spoke aloud, not vows to another person, but promises to myself. Promises I should have made years ago. That I would never again shrink to make others comfortable. That I would stop explaining my worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. That I would choose environments that choose me back. My voice didn't shake, not because I wasn't emotional, but because the words were true. Truth steadies you. There were moments during the ceremony where I caught myself smiling, not the polite smile I'd perfected at family gatherings, but a deep, unguarded one that surprised even me. Healing isn't dramatic, it's subtle. It shows up as ease where there used to be tension, as breath where there used to be tightness, as peace where there used to be noise. Standing there, with salt in the air and sunlight warming my skin, I felt healed not because something had been taken away, but because something had finally been returned to me. I didn't think about my cousin. I didn't think about my aunt. I didn't think about who wasn't there. That was the most powerful part. The absence that once felt like a wound no longer demanded attention. I wasn't performing resilience. I was living it. The sea bore witness, indifferent yet immense, reminding me that my life didn't need their approval to be whole. Cameras were present, but not to stage anything. They captured what unfolded naturally. Laughter carried by the wind, tears wiped away without shame. A woman standing fully in her own light. When I watched the footage later, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I looked free. That's what struck people when the video began to circulate. Not the setting, not the dress, the freedom. The ceremony wasn't a response, it was a declaration. A statement that said, I am not waiting anymore. I am not asking anymore. I am not measuring my milestones against anyone else's timeline or approval. This is my life, and it is worthy of ceremony simply because I exist within it. That's what they never understood. Exclusion only works when you believe the door they closed was the only one available. The sea showed me otherwise. It reminded me that the world is vast, that belonging isn't scarce, that joy doesn't need an invitation list. By the time the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, I felt lighter than I had in years, not vindicated, liberated. Later, when people asked why I did it, I didn't give a dramatic answer. I didn't tell them about the hurt or the exclusion. I simply said, because I wanted to. That sentence carried more power than any confrontation ever could. Wanting something for yourself and honoring that want without apology is an act of self-respect so loud it echoes. The seaside ceremony didn't erase the past, but it rewrote its hold on me. It took every moment I had been made to feel small and answered it with space. It took every silence I had swallowed and answered it with truth spoken aloud. It took every time I was left out and answered it with inclusion on my own terms. That day wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. Right to joy. Right to celebration. Right to a life that doesn't require shrinking. And as the waves continued their endless rhythm, indifferent to family politics and social hierarchies, I understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't just a ceremony by the sea. It was the moment I stopped living on the edges of other people's stories and stepped fully into my own. The video didn't explode the way scandals do. There was no outrage bait, no shouting, no accusations stitched into captions. It spread because people recognized themselves in it. A woman standing by the sea, calm and radiant, claiming joy without apology. There was something disarming about that. The internet is used to pain dressed as spectacle. This was healing dressed as truth, and truth travels fast. At first it moved quietly, a share here, a comment there. This feels like closure. This is what self-respect looks like. Then the algorithm did what it always does when it senses authenticity, it amplified. The clip crossed timelines, oceans, languages. People didn't ask for context, they supplied their own. Excluded siblings, forgotten friends, daughters told to stay small, women erased politely and told to smile about it. The video didn't need explanation because the emotion was universal. Viral vindication isn't loud triumph. It's the moment when the world mirrors back what you've always known but were never allowed to say out loud. I watched strangers defend me more fiercely than family ever had. I watched people articulate the injustice with clarity I'd been denied for years. Comments weren't cruel. They were precise. They didn't invite her because they couldn't control her. This is what happens when you stop begging and start building. Each sentence felt like a brick laid where cracks used to be, and then, inevitably, it reached them. The same relatives who told me not to make it about me saw my face everywhere. On phones passed around dinner tables. In group chats suddenly revived. In whispers disguised as concern. They recognized the coastline. They recognized the posture. They recognized the woman they thought they could quietly sideline. Vindication arrived without a single message sent. That's what made it devastating. I didn't announce anything. I didn't explain. The truth found them on its own. Their reactions varied. Some pretended pride. Some feigned confusion. Some stayed silent, which was the loudest response of all. Silence is different when it's no longer in control. This time, it didn't erase me. It exposed them. People asked questions. Friends of friends connected dots. Why wasn't she invited? Became a refrain they couldn't answer without revealing themselves. Vindication isn't about humiliation, it's about visibility. When your absence becomes noticeable, the lie collapses. What struck me most was how little I cared by then. That's the final stage of vindication. Indifference, not numbness. Freedom. Their realization came too late to matter. I had already crossed the bridge from needing acknowledgement to owning my narrative. The validation I once craved arrived after I'd learned to live without it, and that timing stripped it of power. The world didn't crown me a victim. It recognized me as a woman who chose herself. That distinction mattered. Sympathy fades. Respect endures. And as the views climbed, so did something quieter but far more important. My certainty that I never needed their invitation to be seen. 2. Viral vindication. The moment her story captures global attention, forcing the family to witness what they dismissed. The video didn't explode the way scandals do. There was no outrage bait, no shouting, no accusations stitched into captions. It spread because people recognized themselves in it. A woman standing by the sea, calm and radiant, claiming joy without apology. There was something disarming about that. The internet is used to pain dressed as spectacle. This was healing dressed as truth, and truth travels fast. At first, it moved quietly. A share here, a comment there. This feels like closure. This is what self-respect looks like. Then the algorithm did what it always does when it senses authenticity. It amplified. The clip crossed timelines, oceans, languages. People didn't ask for context, they supplied their own. Excluded siblings. Forgotten friends, daughters told to stay small. Women erased politely and told to smile about it. The video didn't need explanation because the emotion was universal. Viral vindication isn't loud triumph. It's the moment when the world mirrors back what you've always known, but were never allowed to say out loud. I watched strangers defend me more fiercely than family ever had. I watched people articulate the injustice with clarity I'd been denied for years. Comments weren't cruel, they were precise. They didn't invite her because they couldn't control her. This is what happens when you stop begging and start building. Each sentence felt like a brick laid where cracks used to be, and then, inevitably, it reached them. The same relatives who told me not to make it about me saw my face everywhere. On phones passed around dinner tables, in group chats suddenly revived. In whispers disguised as concern. They recognized the coastline. They recognized the posture. They recognized the woman they thought they could quietly sideline. Vindication arrived without a single message sent. That's what made it devastating. I didn't announce anything. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't explain. The truth found them on its own. Their reactions varied. Some pretended pride, some feigned confusion, some stayed silent, which was the loudest response of all. Silence is different when it's no longer in control. This time, it didn't erase me, it exposed them. People asked questions. Friends of friends connected dots. Why wasn't she invited? Became a refrain they couldn't answer without revealing themselves. Vindication isn't about humiliation, it's about visibility. When your absence becomes noticeable, the lie collapses. What struck me most was how little I cared by then. That's the final stage of vindication. Indifference. Not numbness, freedom. Their realization came too late to matter. I had already crossed the bridge from needing acknowledgement to owning my narrative. The validation I once craved arrived after I'd learned to live without it, and that timing stripped it of power. The world didn't crown me a victim. It recognized me as a woman who chose herself. That distinction mattered. Sympathy fades. Respect endures. And as the views climbed, so did something quieter but far more important. My certainty that I never needed their invitation to be seen. 3. Revenge through radiance. Triumph achieved not through confrontation, but by living boldly, beautifully, and unapologetically. Revenge is usually imagined as destruction, raised voices, final words, bridges burned for warmth. But the most effective revenge doesn't scorch the earth. It illuminates it. It doesn't chase the people who hurt you. It outruns them. Radiance is unbearable to those who built their power on your dimming. That's why it works. I didn't confront them because confrontation would have centered them. I didn't demand apologies because apologies would have kept me tethered to their approval. I chose something far more unsettling to people who thrive on hierarchy. I moved on visibly and well. I lived boldly. I let my life speak in full sentences. I stopped curating myself for rooms that never planned to hold me. Radiance isn't performative happiness. It's alignment. It's waking up without rehearsing who you need to be that day. It's choosing beauty because it feeds you, not because it proves a point. It's investing in your body, your work, your friendships with the seriousness you once reserved for keeping the peace. Every boundary I set sharpened my light. Every no made my yes unmistakable. People who once dismissed me began to watch from a distance. That's another truth they don't tell you when you stop asking to be included. Observers multiply. Radiance attracts attention without effort. It reframes the past without a single argument. Suddenly, the story isn't about why you weren't invited. It's about why anyone thought they could afford to exclude you. I didn't erase my history. I transcended its grip. I let joy be loud. I let success be visible. I let love be reciprocal. The revenge wasn't that they noticed, it was that noticing no longer changed my direction. Their opinions lost leverage the moment my life stopped revolving around their reactions. Unapologetic living terrifies people who rely on guilt as control. When you no longer explain yourself, they lose the script. When you no longer minimize your happiness, they lose the hierarchy. Radiance collapses old power structures because it refuses to negotiate its existence. It says, without saying anything at all, I am whole. I am enough. I am not waiting. In the end, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic closure. Just a quiet, irreversible shift. I stopped orbiting their events and became the center of my own. That's the cleanest revenge there is. Not bitterness, not erasure, but a life so full, so honest, so undeniably yours that the past can't reach you anymore. They once told me not to make it about me. So I made it about my life, and that changed everything. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real, life revenge and empowerment stories, where silence becomes strength, grace becomes power, and choosing yourself changes everything.